Now let's go ahead and talk about some wide receiver and tight end busts. Jeff, start us off here. Who is your biggest bust at the wide receiver or tight end position?
Yeah, my biggest bust is tough because I really, really like the talent. But my biggest bust is going to be Drake London as my biggest bust. My concern on Drake London, last year he had a 29% target share. It was fifth in the league. And so he got a massive target share. And we know in that Falcons offense, the volume was not there. And so despite having that huge target share, he finished as wide receiver 31 in PPR scoring. And that was with Kyle Pitts out of the lineup. Now, his biggest week was week 2. That was with Kyle Pitts in the lineup. And so his best game was with Pitts in the lineup. And so you're stepping here, you're taking him wide receiver. Why did I not have this on top of my head? You're taking him 44 overall in underdog. I know that. And he's going off as wide receiver 24. So he's already ascending on that. Wide receiver 24 was a position he didn't deliver on last year. Now he's a young ascending talent. There's a chance that they throw the ball more in that offense because Desmond Ridder relative to Marcus Mariota. But again, you add Bijan Robinson in there, and he's going to demand target share, and he's also going to lead to rushing success. So there's a chance that we don't see major changes in that offense, just another mouth to feed. And my other point on him, too, is going as 44 overall. Kyle Pitts is going at 66 overall. And if you look at a lot of their underlying stats and metrics, they are very, very similar players on paper, and even size-wise, all that. They're similar players. One plays a much more valuable position, potentially, a much more scarce position. That's Pitts, and he's going 22 picks after Drake London. So you have the ability to essentially step into the same exposure at a more premium, more overall valuable position if it hits, and you're doing that multiple rounds later. I just don't know who's drafting Drake London, where he's getting drafted.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you look at the overall numbers, it could be a little bit misleading because Drake London technically has a higher target share, but like you said, he had the benefit of playing half the season without Kyle Pitts, which is going to pad that number a little bit. When they were both on the field, they were putting up very, very similar numbers. Target rate, actually, which is, targets per route run, Kyle Pitts was actually drawing more targets per route run than Drake London was last year, and he was doing that while he was on the field with Drake London, and like you said, at a much scarcer position. So this is kind of a silly question to ask because we're comparing two different positions, but they're such similar players, like you mentioned. Jeff, who do you think is just the better talent, Kyle Pitts or Drake London?
I think Kyle Pitts is the better talent, to be honest with you. I think he plays a more difficult position. You're asking him to play inline tight end. That's putting a little bit more on his plate relative to London. And, it may be splitting hairs a little bit, but overall, I think Pitts is more of a dynamic difference maker.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this on a podcast right now, you couldn't see it, but as soon as you said Kyle Pitts, Corey and I both turned into bobbleheads, completely agreeing with you. And the thing is, Kyle Pitts isn't asked to block hardly at all. I just wrote a player spotlight on Kyle Pitts where I went deep into his 2022 season. And when you look at his utilization, where he lines up on the field, looking at slot snaps, inline snaps, and out wide snaps, he is almost perfectly in line with some of the highest performing guys at that position. Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, Zach Ertz. That's how Kyle Pitts is used. So he is a tight end, but he actually took more snaps last year out wide than he took in line. So he's an extremely talented, young and ascending wide receiver that you can play at the tight end position, drafted rounds after Drake London. So completely with you there. Drake London, love the talent, hate the ADP. Corey, you have anything to add about this? I mean, we've talked a lot about this Falcons offense over the last few weeks. It's fun to speculate about with all these young, hyper-talented athletes there. Corey, what do you have to add, if anything at all?
Yeah, that's right. So London rookie season, 117 targets is awesome. 72 receptions is not great. It's great, but we like to see more based on that volume. I think Mariota had about a 61% completion percentage, and now in steps Desmond Ridder. In those 4 games he played, he had a 63%. So we may be looking at a similar target quality. There's always the option that Ridder's going to take that step forward through developing and stuff, but who knows on this run-heavy offense, like you guys are saying, and if these quarterbacks are going to be able to get the ball to their receivers efficiently.
Yeah, and what's funny about that completion percentage, too, is his on-target rate was so much lower than that. Kyle Pitts and Drake London were regularly bailing Marcus Mariota out of terrible passes. If he didn't have these elite pass catchers in those two, his numbers would have been even worse. But, Jeff, what was it you were going to say?
Well, one, I wanted to plug the great spotlight that you did that work on Kyle Pitts, but I do want to say too that Kyle Pitts is a player that I think you nailed it exactly. And I wrote the spotlight on him last year, and it was similar usage as a wide receiver. If Kyle Pitts was in a better passing offense, if Kyle Pitts had delivered a strong season, there would be major pushes on his eligibility. And because I think people would bear down, they would realize that he's not used as a tight end. And that's he's the wide receiver 1 or the wide receiver 2, and London is also the wide receiver 1 or the wide receiver 2 in this offense.
Yeah, and that was one thing I talked about in the article is we looked at all of the underlying metrics in year 1, and that's why we saw Kyle Pitts as such a buy in year 2. Well, guess what? He increased his target share, he increases yards per route run, he increased his targets per route run, he increased his touchdown rate, and somehow decreased his fantasy output. I mean, just such a head-scratching phenomena between the talent and the production that it's tough to bet on either of these guys. But if I'm going to bet on one of them, I'm going to bet on the one that you can get 2 rounds later that has tight end eligibility. So I'm with you. It's really tough to stomach Drake London at his current ADP, despite how talented he is. Now, if you're watching the show on YouTube right now, do us a favor, click the link in the description below for the full podcast version of this show. Right now, we just break this up, take some of the best parts out, and put it on YouTube. But if you want to check out the full podcast version, somewhere between 35, 40 minutes long with introductions and banter and jokes and all that fun stuff, find a link in the description below. You can also find the podcast anywhere podcasts can be found by searching Footballguys, Dave Kluge, The Launchpad, or anything else that reminds you of this show. But link in the description below. Be sure to check out the podcast and leave a review if you enjoy that. So, Corey, same question over to you. Who are you looking at as the potentially biggest bust at the wide receiver or tight end position this year?
Oh, biggest bust.
Biggest bust.
I'm keeping it with the tight end. I'm a big tight end guy, and my tight end bust is going to be Evan Ingram, where he is currently being drafted at 94 overall. So, finishing as a borderline tight end 1 is obviously possible. We all understand, touchdowns will raise that. I'm just kind of skeptical to see this similar season to the one he had in 2022 as we enter 2023, a season where he had 53% of his games over 10 PPR points, and that's even with tight end premium scoring, and he saw 36% of his receiving yards in just 2 games. We just talked about how Kirk is a sleeper for Dave, and it kind of backpacks all of that. We're coming off a career year. Ingram is being drafted near the end of round 8. We all know Doug Peterson. He transformed Jacksonville, and they're looking to continue their success. Peterson, he's been notorious for utilizing his tight ends in Philadelphia, where Zach Ertz averaged 126.8 targets per season. I disregarded the season where Ertz played 11 games. He had about 72 targets there, so we're probably still looking around the same. However, we just know Jacksonville added Calvin Ridley, and Christian Kirk's will still command targets. This feels a little bit redundant to keep talking about this, but Zay Jones, he's still on the team, and he actually saw more targets than Ingram in 2022. So the major difference between Ertz and Ingram is pretty much Ertz is just arguably the better target on those Peterson's team. Well, now we are inserting at least 2 wide receivers to command more targets, and then whatever happens with Zay Jones. So Evan Ingram, he only had 9 red zone targets in 2022, so I don't see a reason why that's going to change and maybe see an increase, especially that Calvin Ridley is playing there too.
Yeah, and I think, we talk about recency bias all the time, and I think that Evan Ingram right now, his ADP is very much so recency bias, because if you look at his overall season, it really wasn't anything to write home about. I mean, he had some 1-target games, 2-target games, like some absolute clunkers that really, really hurt you. But then from weeks 14 through 16, when those fantasy points really, really matter, trying to get into the playoffs, the first couple rounds of the playoffs, he averaged 11 targets, 113 yards, and had 2 touchdowns over that 3-game stretch. So people think, I had Evan Ingram, probably picked him up off of waivers because he was dropped in most leagues midseason. They picked this guy up off of waivers. He's a hammer for him that helps bring him to a fantasy championship, and all of a sudden he's getting drafted as tight end 8. So I'm with you, Corey. It's tough for me because as a talent, I love Evan Ingram. I was beating the drum for him last offseason. But guess what? Last offseason, you can get him in the 18th round as like tight end 24. Now you're paying up for him with a tight end 8 price tag. And so much of this just comes down to ADP and value more than anything else. And some of the guys that are getting drafted around Evan Ingram, I'd rather take Jameson Williams, even with the suspension, knowing what he can do in the spike weeks he could provide on a high-powered Detroit offense. Juju Smith-Schuster, the wide receiver 1 in New England. There's a lot of guys that I would prefer ahead of Evan Ingram that you could actually draft behind him. So I like that. Jeff, we've been talking about the Jacksonville offense quite a bit. Do you have anything to add with Ingram, though, now that we're talking about him?
Well, I think that some ways that you can add value conceptually, and especially looking at, so if we're talking about underdog ADP, I'll give you a would you rather. Would you rather have Evan Ingram and Chase Brown, or would you rather have Zach Charbonnet and we'll go with Mike Gesicki?
Oh, Mike Gesicki and Sharps, easily.
I think I would agree with that.
That's what you can do at ADP. And I think that one of the biggest things in underdog, especially, I think Corey makes great points on Evan Ingram and you both have made great points about the Jacksonville offense throughout the episode. But you're looking at ADP, looking at where tight ends are landing, especially in underdog, and understanding that format, the best ball format, you're grabbing those good weeks, you're not grabbing those bad weeks. And so players like Evan Ingram going in round 8, 9, 10, that range, relative to the tight ends that are going around 15, 16, 17, there's just a lot more value, I think, on those later tight ends, because I think that you'll end up in a vacuum, end up with the same amount of startable weeks out of those later players, but you're getting such a higher value, especially running back in that area of the earlier ones right now.
Wow, Jeff, you were just like setting me up to just talk about all of my content that I've been writing lately. I just wrote an article about injury away running backs, and I talk exactly about that you want to save those late round picks for running backs, because those are the ones that are most likely to not just slightly exceed their ADP, but to smash their ADP. And, the example that I talked about, if you draft the wide receiver 91 and get wide receiver 37 production, probably not going to do all that much for you over the course of an entire season. But if you get that same production for the running back, same thing, you're probably not thinking much. But what if all of that production comes in the second half of the season and you're getting double-digit points every single week, and that guy is outperforming your first-round running back? That's exactly what Isaiah Pacheco did last year. Getting drafted at the very end of the season, didn't do anything, or the very end of the draft, didn't do anything for the first half of the season, and then averaged 12.5 points down the stretch and won a lot of people fantasy championships. So, talking game theory here a little bit, I want to save as many late round picks as I can just to load up on those injury away running backs. Something else you talked about, Jeff, is, not disliking players, just trying to play the ADP game a little bit. And that's exactly where, this is a segue into the guy I want to talk about. Deebo Samuel is arguably one of my favorite players in the league. And I was beating the drum for this guy 2 years ago, kind of made a name for myself as the Deebo Samuel guy heading into the 2021 season. He was getting drafted outside of wide receiver 40 range and finished as the wide receiver 3. As much as I was obnoxiously victory lapping on Twitter and saying I told you so, the reality is he even smashed my expectation that year. My whole thesis was you could draft Deebo Samuel as a wide receiver 40 and maybe you'll get lucky and get wide receiver 2 output. I did not expect him to turn into a running back and get 8 goal line touches and have efficiency through the roof. But now here we are, 2 years removed from that unbelievable season where he averaged over 20 points per game. And I think people are still holding on to hope that he's going to be able to return that type of efficiency. And I just don't see it happening, because the reality is Deebo Samuel's been in the league for 4 years now. In 3 of those seasons, he has been a low-end wide receiver 3. In 1 of those seasons, he was an elite wide receiver 1. And that season was just kind of weird and fluky. That was the year that they traded up to get Trey Sermon and ended up not even playing him. And then they plugged in Elijah Mitchell, and Elijah Mitchell couldn't stay healthy. And then they tried going to Jeff Wilson Jr., and Jeff Wilson Jr. got hurt. And Deebo Samuel got plugged into this Deebo role that we still talk about years later that realistically doesn't exist anymore. The Deebo role in San Francisco is now Christian McCaffrey's role. But people are still expecting Deebo to take that role back. And the split show it last year. If we look before Christian McCaffrey showed up, Deebo was still putting up some pretty good numbers, 16.4 PPR points per game. Nowhere near what he did in 2021, but respectable and serviceable numbers. Once CMC showed up, he dropped to 11.4 PPR points per game, which is exactly in line with what we saw during his first 2 seasons. So it's tough for me to say. because I love watching Deebo Samuel play. You look at his highlights, he is arguably one of the best highlight reels of any player in the NFL. I mean, I just think about him last year, stiff arming Jalen Ramsey into the dirt. I mean, he does fun things almost every single game, but right now getting drafted as the wide receiver 17, that is just entirely too rich for me. And again, we start talking about like the other players that are getting drafted in that area. You look behind Deebo Samuel, Amari Cooper, who is going to be the wide receiver 1 on a revamped Cleveland Browns offense. You know, if Deshaun Watson can take that step forward, Amari Cooper has wide receiver 1 in his range of outcomes this year. DeAndre Hopkins, we don't know where he's going to land, but he's got a much higher ceiling than Deebo Samuel. Christian Watson, Keenan Allen, Jerry Jeudy, Mike Williams, even Drake London is a guy that I think that's kind of where I would be comfortable drafting Deebo Samuel, is near Drake London, but he's going a full 3 rounds behind Deebo. So, Jeff, Corey, I don't know who wants to talk about this a little bit, but am I crazy for fading a player as talented as Deebo Samuel?
No, I don't think you're as crazy for that. The one encouraging thing is Deebo Samuel came out and admitted that he was out of shape last year, and I think that anybody watching that could have seen that. I think there was he's wrapped up in that contract negotiation, so that was going on, and that was a big part of it. And my other thought on potential positive for him would be the contract status of Brandon Ayuk, and if the 49ers get to a point where they decide that Brandon Ayuk won't be in their future, do they bear down on just Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey as their primary parts of their offense? Those would be my only real concerns, or not even concern, his path to success, I think. But I think you're exactly right. That's a player I don't really understand his ADP. I don't really understand. We play a lot of dynasty. I know Corey loves dynasty. I'm the dynasty captain over here at Football Guys. It's a player that I got a lot of 2 years ago, and I've moved off a lot of this year, especially. And so it's, I think that it's one of those that it's a situation that you can really only go down probably from the value that he's held, and he has headed that direction. So I think you made great points. Good job, Dave.
Yeah, and he's a wide receiver, but he also, like, the physicality that he plays with, like, he's going to age like a running back. He's not going to be a wide receiver that is doing this into his early 30s. And here he is at 27 years old, and that's when we see running backs start to trend down. And I don't want to say that Deebo Samuel is a running back, but his physicality does lend to more injuries that we've seen throughout his career. So there's also the concern that, his age starts catching up to him, and his body starts to break down a little bit as he approaches his age 28 season. Corey, anything you'd like to add about the 49ers, Deebo Samuel, or anything we've talked about on this show so far today?
Yeah, I mean, I love Brandon Ayuk, and I always thought he's just the better wide receiver compared to Deebo. And, you're talking about the physicality. Ayuk only has about 13 career carries, so he's going to be utilized as a natural wide receiver coming up 114 target season here in 2022. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen. And, George Kittle, who knows what's going to happen with him. He's also very physical. He played 15 games last year. I know he's been injured. He was on Theo Von's podcast. I don't know if anybody likes comedians. It was really cool to see a little more insight into like an NFL organization. So if you want to go watch that to find a little more about that, especially injuries that he talked about.
Yeah, and looking right now, I mean, Brandon Ayuk, since you mentioned him, he's getting drafted as wide receiver 30, which is crazy.
That should have been a sleeper.
Yeah, I was going to say, I could have just as easily talked about Brandon Ayuk being a sleeper as I'm sitting here talking about Deebo Samuel being a bust. Yeah, so go ahead, fade Deebo Samuel and pick up some Brandon Ayuk in your drafts this year if there's one takeaway from today's show. But fellas, great time as always. Can't wait to see you both in person in just a couple months here. Before we sign off, though, one more time, Corey, let everyone know where they can find you on social media.
That's Corey Spala, CoreySpala. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Jeff. I'm excited to get started here over at Football Guys as well.
Yeah, brand new hire. It's awesome that you get to join on the show already. Yeah, but you'll be here in no time, cranking out some content at footballguys.com. So be sure to check that out. Jeff, let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at @ForWhomJBellTolls. You can find me with Football Guys, and check out all the content on footballguys.com.
And I'm Dave Kluge. You can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. But we talked about this a little bit. I teased it last week, but you got to check out footballguys.com/rankings to see what we just unveiled. The most customizable ranking set I have ever seen. And we talked about this a little bit as we were designing it, but right now with so many different league settings and scoring settings and roster settings, shouldn't your rankings kind of reflect that same level of detail? Well, we did just that. Footballguys.com/rankings. I don't want to give away too much. Check it out yourself. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. On the right side of your screen, you're going to be able to see some other videos that we have here on the Football Guys YouTube page to help you prep for the 2023 fantasy football season. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe at youtube.com/footballguys so you can see all of the video content that we have coming your way, like the Audible, the Pretend GM, the Football Guys College Football Show, and so much more at youtube.com/footballguys.